Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Between Classes by QIA. And we are very fortunate this morning to be having within our studios here at QIA Muhammad Jalal. He's political scientist, educator, host of the Thinking Muslim podcast. Muhammad, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, Maulana Ismail. It's really wonderful to be with you. Jazakallah khair.
If you're not aware, and we'll try to unpack this over the next few minutes, it's become such a household name across the English-speaking world, particularly the Thinking Muslim podcast, which has really explored key issues in depth with esteemed Muslim thinkers, academics and scholars. And I really feel it's been at the cutting edge of some very critical discussions that Muslims are having throughout the world. Particularly over the past 2 years, but as we will find out, the podcast is a bit older than that as well. Let's just anchor this discussion, Muhammad, by your visit to South Africa. Is this your first visit to South Africa?
No, subhanAllah. So I have family in South Africa. So I spent a lot of my younger years coming here and visiting my family here in Johannesburg. MashaAllah, we have a very large family here. And subhanAllah, I haven't been for the last many years, actually. So it's been some time to catch up with everyone. But subhanAllah, it's been great to come back and see the progress, not only of my family, but the progress of the Muslim community. I mean, we're sitting here in this school premises, and it's wonderful to see how the Muslim community has organized themselves in this country.
Alhamdulillah, I want to just latch onto that bit for a short while. I saw you taking a bit of a walkabout here in the school, which is obviously, as you can see, named after Qurtuba. And to take the liberty of speaking to a person who I would imagine is very well read, very well researched, what does that name evoke for you, Qurtuba? In a nostalgic sense, as well as its relevance for today?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. If any of your viewers and listeners have been to Cordoba in Spain, of course, you would see, you would have a mixture of emotions. You know, on the one level, you would see the greatness, the vastness of Islamic history, and just how Muslims govern Spain, and the sort of the civilizational epoch, I suppose, of Muslim civilization is on display even today by looking at the architecture, which was preserved by a country that tried to erase the Islamic past. But at the same time, you have a feeling of nostalgia, maybe even a sadness for what we lost of Muslim Spain. So it's a reminder, but also a symbol of hope, I think, for us, Cordoba. And I think, I would imagine, the founders of this school and, of course, this complex, the Cordoba complex, probably spent some time trying to, I suppose, match it, trying to develop a name that, at the same time, gives hope to our community, but also maybe sends it sends a sign to us that we should remember to preserve what we have, so that we don't lose it. So yeah, I think Cordoba is a very good name for an Islamic school, and for what you've got here as a Muslim community. I suppose maybe something that I was thinking about while I was speaking there is, I think another thing we get from Cordoba is the complacency. Some historians argue that one of the reasons for our decline in Spain, one of the reasons why we were defeated ultimately by the Catholic conquests that took our Cordoba and our Granada and our Seville and all of the southern Spain that we had originally had. I think one of the reasons was the complacency we felt. We felt that we were in such a comfortable position as a Muslim ummah that we didn't have to worry about any external threats. And maybe that's a great place to springboard today's conversation about Muslims in South Africa, because subhanAllah, I think you have probably one of the most advantageous, at least political positions that I have seen, if we were to call this the West. I know it's not the West geographically, but across the English-speaking world, you've got one of the best. I mean, you've got a government who's not antagonistic at all towards the Muslim faith. And that is a blessing, of course. But also, I think that should also make us wary of being over-complacent.
Yes.
And looking inwards and forgetting about our ummah, forgetting about Palestine and Gaza, and believing that we have reached a place in the world or a position in the world which is decent and comfortable. Because sometimes, as we know from the Muslims in Spain, all of this can turn around.
It can turn around very quickly indeed.
Yeah.
From that particular introduction or just reflection from your side, which I really appreciate on Qurtuba with all its texture that's required, I want to then move into this idea of a thinking Muslim. Obviously, Qurtuba representing an intellectual hub of the Muslim world, and so much good thought emerged from there, just like Baghdad and the rest. This idea of a thinking Muslim, I would imagine you wouldn't have chosen a name like that for your discussions, for your podcast very lightly. What motivated that?
Yeah, in relevance to your project here, your education project, I met a group of parents in California, actually, when I was there last month. And a sister, a parent who's very active within the parenting community, the Muslim parenting community, made a comment which really struck me. And I've come back to this comment on a number of occasions. She said something like, for a long time, we were trying to preserve the identity of our young children in a state, in a country which works against the Islamic identity. And so we were trying to preserve, the best we can our Muslim, and that's a very defensive way of educating our youngsters, to be fearful of X and to be fearful of Y, and to come back to the tradition in a way to defend yourself from westernization. And then she said she came to the realization that why is this the height of my ambition as a Muslim parent, as a group who are trying to shift the needle when it comes to Islamic education? We shouldn't be thinking about ourselves from a defensive posture. We should be thinking about ourselves as we're trying to shift our generation civilizationally. In other words, what she meant by that was we're trying to create the Salahuddin generation. Those people who aren't just going to be scared of their shadows, right, and be worried about this influence or that influence, or try to just preserve, and that's it. That's the height of our ambition. But actually, we're trying to push ahead. We're trying to create creative, intelligent, thinking young men and women who are going to establish a firm foothold and for our ummah, but also deal with these many challenges our ummah faces. And so we want courageous individuals. We want brave people who speak haqq. We want a young Muslim generation who go back to the tradition to try to revitalize how they view the modern world, right? And how they view politics and how they view the ummah's problems. In other words, I think what she said, and I really struck me, what she said was, we need a younger generation that's better than us. Many of us, we built the institutions, we try to preserve things. Alhamdulillah, that's, I think, a necessary step in this sort of direction of reviving the ummah. But now we need the Khalid bin Walids, we need the Salahuddin Ayyubis, we need those people who are the Muhammad Fatihs. We need those people who are going to think, okay, now we have this grounding in Islamic education. What am I going to do to further this call of Islam and this call of our ummah? And I think I think it's simple but quite profound, actually, because it leads to two different types of education. One is defensive, and one is looking to create individuals, actually, not just like sometimes, if we think about socialism in its education tries to make everyone the same. And so everyone remains, within a particular, mind frame, and you don't get creative individuals because everyone is meant to be workers within a worker solidarity, right? Whereas, if we look at the Sahaba, and I'm sure you are far more familiar with the seerah than I am, but if we look at the Sahaba, I'm just amazed at how many creative individuals there were. Khalid bin Walid, radiallahu anhum, was very different to Abu Bakr, radiallahu anhu. Abu Bakr and Umar, radiallahu anhu, were very different individuals. In fact, didn't we hear that, these two individuals never agreed on a single issue, to the degree that the Prophet ﷺ once said, if Abu Bakr and Umar agree, then it's my opinion. Because he knew that if they both agree and came to a consensus, then it must be right. Because, they're always disagreeing with one another on all issues, right? Now, in today's world, we would think this is bad. How can two Muslims have these disagreements with one another? But the Prophet ﷺ encouraged it because he wanted to get the best standard before moving ahead with his agenda.
Well, one thing that I really enjoy about your discussions, Muhammad, is the fact that maybe many other discussions would veer off in many different areas. Other kind of interviews or podcasts, or there'd be a lot of socializing, and to get to the crux of the matter would take quite a while. One would have to dig into it. Yeah. There seems to be a very clear, thought pattern, and one can emerge from that podcast with a very high level view of the topic, which obviously speaks to then the research that goes behind it and your methodology. Yeah. What goes into a typical episode? And I mean, you on the other side of the mic today, but many of the guests and the topics you've engaged with, I guess this has also been a journey for you in obviously with your own background in political science, but a kind of education in those topics that makes you be able to speak fairly confidently on those, having researched and engaged in those discussions.
Yeah, Maulana, that's a very good question. So we have a team of researchers who feed into the question process. So like I once asked someone who was in marketing, to try to sort of understand what we've created as the Thinking Muslim. And she came back she said, what you have is you've got two very interesting components. You've got the right guests and you've got the right questions. And I think that summed up what the Thinking Muslim podcast is about. We try to choose. So, for example, at the moment, we're trying to find a guest on Sudan because, of course, what our ummah is facing in Sudan is horrid. But we have a short list of maybe 12 or 13 guests. But we're trying to find someone who understands the issues in a very meticulous and deep way, rather than just someone who's maybe a public speaker who's recently come across the subject and learned a few things in a superficial way. So, we try to find the best guest as possible for a particular topic. But also then we have this collaborative process where we put questions together, send it out to the group, and I try to find within the group people who've got, like Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anh, people with different opinions, so that they feed into the process. And inshallah, we refine those questions and find the best questions. So I would like to say, by the way, that, it's all the product of my ability to coin, but it's not really. It's a collaborative process. And it's, I know very little about the subject. I mean, that's partly why I started a podcast, because I wanted to engage with topics in a far deeper way. Because I have so many blind spots in my own intelligence, in my own understanding. So we have a team. You mentioned something at the very beginning in your question. You said that there is this meticulousness that goes into crafting these shows, and we don't tend to focus on the personal aspects. We jump straight in to the. That's deliberate because one of the issues I was trying to combat, I would suggest, in when I started the podcast, was this superficialness that exists on social media. Now, I'm not saying having small talk is a good thing, right? It's not a bad thing, but I know that a lot of the output that comes, especially from Britain, is very superficial sometimes, and it's very surface level, and it's all about trying to get clicks and trying to say things which are outrageous so that people will. And I wanted to work against that. But also I wanted to show the world that we actually do have very intelligent Muslims in the Muslim Ummah, but also in Britain. Like, we're not all people who chase clicks. So, maybe some small talk is required. I think it is. And I try to get that before the camera rolls. But yeah, it's a good observation to make.
And then the type of personality or experience you come with yourself to this, I mean, you generally described as a political scientist.
Yeah.
What type of issues were you dealing with, or programs were you running prior to setting up this podcast?
Yeah, subhanAllah. So I don't want to. Actually, one of the things, and this may come across as false, humility or something, and may Allah save me from that. But the idea behind the podcast isn't to focus on me and to focus on like who I am and to put me in the center of the conversation. The idea of the podcast is to get the best out of my guests. And I think the way to do that is to ask the right questions and then to sit back and let them say what they need to say. So, like from my background perspective, I'm, as you said, I'm an educator, so I taught politics for many years, for 15 years, and I think that gave me the ability only to be more inquisitive. Maybe that's what I bring to the table, to this inquisitiveness. I want to find out more about a particular issue because I don't know about that issue. Like, one of the things I realize as a political scientist is that when sometimes people come to me and say, "Oh, what do you think about the political situation in South Africa?" And I'm at a loss because a political scientist isn't going to know about the politics of every country in the world, right? And so I have to then go back and say, okay, let me understand what is South Africa and what is its background and history. And so, yeah, I think I brought that to the podcast, that sort of inquisitiveness that's probably required for a podcast like ours.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you is the issue of short form versus long form.
Yeah.
And perhaps that speaks to what you were just saying a short while ago about the clicks and trying to work with the algorithm and draw a lot of attention. You've kind of used this method for long form and still, I mean, if one has to look at it in terms of the engagement, in terms of people who are viewing the content, it's still a very significant amount. What motivates that choice? Because many people are just bought into that idea. We need to meet people where they are, shorter attention spans, etc. Is this part of your entire vision to be able to take the Ummah a step up and realize our true potential? Is that how you view it?
I think so. Look, I'm not against the idea of short form content. I think, there are certainly, you have different audiences and different people will require different formats. I totally agree with that. But I wanted to challenge this idea that everyone said to me at the very beginning, which is you're not going to get an audience because people are not willing to sit down and listen to or watch something for 1 hour and a half. I remember the first program I brought out, that is exactly what a friend of mine said to me. He said, no, it's not going to work because today it's all about 20-minute content, right? You're not going to get Muslims to sit down and listen to something for a longer period of time. I don't know. I felt from my interactions with the people around me, even as an educator, when I was interacting with young people, these weren't Muslims necessarily, just young people. I mean, there was a thirst for deeper knowledge. And if you can find a format that gives them an ability to grasp that knowledge, I mean, people are willing to sit down. And I'm sometimes humbled by the types of people who come up to me and say, I watch this program with my entire family, right? These aren't, so-called university educated professors or something. These are ordinary Muslims who are who found a format that enlightens them and opens their minds up. So I don't agree actually with the premise that the Muslim Ummah has now dumbed down to the degree that we can only deal with, I don't know, these TikTok clips. And we have to work against that as well, because you know this in the Islamic sciences. You're not going to understand the subject until you engage with it in a very deep and profound way. And that does require reading, that does require engagements in the oral tradition, it requires talking to a teacher, it requires engaging with experts. And I think all Muslims, especially in the situation we're in today, we have to increase our intellectual capacity, in order to move forward.
The podcast is called The Thinking Muslim, but I would imagine with the type of guests that are hosted on there and the discussions that are happening at a very high level, many people who are in leadership positions, who influence policy and so forth, this would also gain or garner a lot of attention from people outside the Muslim community. Can you speak to us about that? Any anecdotal details on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and no one's asked me this before actually, but I think it's an interesting question, because especially since October the 7th, since Gaza, I have seen a remarkably higher number of comments that come from non-Muslims on the platform. I think what Gaza has done is it's shown to the Western world what it means to be a resilient Muslim. The people of Gaza have shown this immense steadfastness, and I think the world looks at them with a how do we understand this? Like, if this was happening in London or happening in New York, the entire society would be falling apart. But the Muslims of Gaza have shown this quality, and so non-Muslims are now looking around for sources to try to understand why. Why is it that Gaza has remained so steadfast? Why have they remained so resilient? Why is it that, and what is it about Islam? Because of course, when they view the man and woman who's lost everything, and they cry out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it has an impact on these people. So, often we get comments from non-Muslims, atheists, Christians, believers of other faiths who follow the podcast, and they say things like, we found that this is the gateway into the mindset of the people of Gaza. Like we've understood now what these people are thinking. And also these non-Muslims, they're trying to grapple with modernity and grapple with Western ideas, and have never really thought of Islam as an antidote to any of that, right? And so Gaza has given them a prompt and a prod to start to consider and think about Islam. There are people who today are reading Quran, the translation of Quran, that then you would never have imagined these people will be reading guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think it's a really great question, and I just wish I had a way of quantifying that. I think 30% of the viewership are non-Muslims, judging by the comments. This is the impression, or maybe 20 to 30%, just judging by the comments. And the comments normally from non-Muslims, by the way, are less cynical sometimes than Muslim comments. The Muslim comments often, you will get, oh, this is never going to change, or we're never, we're in a slump and Gaza is proven. You will get those sorts of comments. I mean, not many, but you'll get those sorts of comments. With the non-Muslims, you'll get, I'm just heartened by what I've viewed here, and I see you Muslims have something deep and profound within you that keeps you going. And I wish I had that. I wish I could believe like you, would be the comments we get. So I think they're truly searching for something, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow our platforms to be a guidance, to be a way of guidance for them, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah. I want to ask you again, within a youth setting, obviously you've set up a youth wing of the Thinking Muslim recently, but I've also understood that you do educate young Muslims about issues like liberalism beyond your podcast.
Yeah.
So, for example, within a school setting like this, what would your approach be to teaching young people about liberalism, or what kind of program would you take them through? And more than anything else, the entry point to affirming why this topic is so relevant for them to actually bite onto the idea.
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, because we have to prepare our youngsters not only to deal, to be confident in their Islam, but also we have to prepare them to be able to interact with the ideologies around them. I met another Maulana recently who said here in South Africa, who said to me, one of the problems you face here is that even those who are well educated, who go to Islamic schools, once they enter the university scene, they come across so many ideas, leftist ideas, right, conservative ideas, and they don't seem to have a filter, a way to organize these ideas and to engage with these ideas such that they remain confident in their Islam, right? So, of course, we don't want Muslims to just be defensive, but at the same time, we need to recognize that our youngsters are interacting with the non-Muslim society and are interacting with the ideologies of non-Muslims. And some of these ideologies will confuse them. And what I try to do is set up a course for young Muslims before they go to university. Because I think what we realize is that university is the point, is probably the greatest asset that Western ideology has in inculcating values which sometimes conflict with Islam. And so, in the West, if you go to Britain or America, it's not just implicit, it's an explicit program. They make sure that when young Muslims enter this university terrain, that they push values that really challenge, even though they can't see, the Muslim students can't automatically see that challenge, but challenge some very basic notions of Islamic belief, right? So I think we have to prepare our youngsters to challenge and to be confident in their Islam. And part of that is to understand the fallacies of liberalism, which is, of course, the basic ideology of the West. So again, without being defensive, we have to teach. Now, of course, in your setting, you have to teach this in an age-appropriate way. So very young Muslims, very young students are going to have to, they're not necessarily will be interacting with these ideologies. And so sometimes it's better to embed the Islamic tradition first and to make that the sort of the basis. But as they get older, and as they're going to interact, especially if your students go on to university, which many of them do here, I think in the final year or two, there needs to be a curricula that allows them to appreciate the straight line from the crooked line. Because when you go to university and someone starts to talk about equality or freedom or individualism, these sound really nice ideas. They sound very appealing, right? Why would I be against individualism? Why would I be against freedom? Freedom is nice. Freedom is what we got here in 1994. We need freedom, right? But if we're not able to break down these ideologies and to deconstruct them and to make them confident that these ideologies are actually problematic from an Islamic perspective, then actually what happens is you're sending people into a minefield, and that minefield is potentially going to. By the way, I don't think many Muslims who go to an Islamic school will end up being atheists. I think there's enough there to build a confidence in the Muslim youth, but I do think it will confuse them, and Palestine is a good. This as someone who's been very active on Palestine. So many of our young Muslims believe that leftist ideologies are the tools by which we fight the Palestinian cause, right? To the degree that Palestine, unfortunately for young Muslims, has become a gateway to embracing socialist and communist ideas. And that's simply because we as educators, we haven't given these people a filter through which they can see the haqq for what it is and the batil for what it is. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that we come across these well-meaning non-Muslims and say to them, we're not going to support you and be with you because we're Muslim and you're socialist. Of course, we need to build alliances, but those alliances have to come from a place of confidence and strength, rather than a place of ideological weakness. And I think a lot of our youngsters go into universities and go into activist life from that position of ideological weakness.
A final focus that many people are keen to hear about, the Thinking Muslim has hosted many high impact guests and many beneficial discussions over the past 4 years. Yeah. But obviously one person looms large, to the extent that I think he has come to be seen in some instances as a co-host of the podcast. Yes. Or such a regular on the podcast. And this is Sami Hamdi. So I say it with a bit of a smile on the face. I mean, given that Sami was in South Africa very recently, left many fond memories. But obviously at the moment, the prevailing emotion is one of pain. And I just want you to share perhaps your immediate thoughts at the moment on why your reaction to the incarceration of Sami, and any of the latest information that you may have.
Yeah, subhanallah. So I spent the last week before he was incarcerated with Sami in California, and Sami was going around the country, and this was one of his stops, California. And his basic message to the Muslim community is that we need to defeat AIPAC and Zionism. And the elections that are coming up next year is a way to do that. And so Sami, he was trying to incite and help and engage with the Muslim communities to try to unify them behind this cause of sticking with the Palestinian cause. I think Sami is a very resilient individual. And I know his parents, and I've got to know his parents very well, especially since he was incarcerated. And I know they inculcated, that going back to the first conversation, that we don't want to just build like Muslims in a defensive posture, and we don't want to just create like Muslims who are let's say average, right? We want to create the next Salahuddin Ayyubis. We want to create the next Khalid bin Walids. We want to create people who are going to actually push forward the Muslim. And I think, with all credit to his parents, they have developed with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help, developed, an individual who has got a very deep reserve, and he's able to combat, the challenges around him with confidence. And, he's, as you know from his programs, my conversations with him, he has a very strong connection with Quran and with Seerah, and so he's able to, to compare the situation he faces or we face today with this. I remember one of the things he said on the stage when we were going from place to place in California. He talked about the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, and how before he became Al-Aziz, before he became the celebrated person of his time, he went through these immense challenges. And one challenge was he was incarcerated. And Sami was saying this a few days before, and and I think Sami, the point he was making was that this is a necessary part of your iman. Like, you have to face, if you're on the haqq, you have to face this. And in fact, if you're not facing these challenges, then you have to sort of ask yourself, am I really doing what I need to do for my ummah, right? So I think, Sami is very, very resilient. There's some brothers have gone to visit him in the last 10 days, and they talk about a person who is optimistic, even though he's in a very, subhanAllah, he's in a cell with 80 people. But he's optimistic, and, he's looking at the bright side, and he thanks those on the outside that have raised his cause and who are talking about him on social media. I would say, that I can't stress enough, the conversation we've had about education, we've had about the Thinking Muslim. We need, dare I say it, people like Sami and better than Sami, actually. We need a generation of people who are going to be courageous and brave and creative, and who are going to, inshallah ta'ala, help our ummah and find solutions to our ummah, so that that we can deal with these great challenges that we face as a community, inshallah.
I just want to touch on the perhaps experience side of this again. I'll ask you, or you could, interject at the end of that to be able to say what is your call, or how do we mobilize for Sami at this moment. But it just seems as if, when some of those episodes were being recorded, there was a kind of very high energy within the room, when Sami would speak. And I think you compiled all of those at some point into kind of a spiritual booster. What was it like, in the midst of those conversations with him?
I'm going to talk about another side of Sami Hamdi, because we look at, you look at the courageous, but Sami Hamdi is a human being like you and I. Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I believe this strongly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings people together at the right moment. So Sami was a person I knew for a long time. And I knew him once when we had an audio podcast before the video, and in the audio podcast, I brought him on, and at that time, Sami played the role of the political analyst, so he was very straight. He played a straight bat, as they say, and so I knew him. I had him in my contact list, and then something arose, and I wanted him to come back on the show. Now we were video, and he kept on refusing. He said, "Oh, I can't make it. I can't come." And one time he agreed. I said, great, Jazakallah khair. And then, maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes before, he said, I'm sorry, something really urgent has come up. I can't come to the show. So I said, khalas, I'm not going to invite Sami onto my show again, because who is this guy? He's a political analyst who's refusing to come on the show. I can find someone else, right? So for a long time, I left it. And then, subhanAllah, I don't know what it was. I had something happened in Saudi Arabia, something happened. And I wanted to contact someone. I said, let me get this guy, Sami Hamdi, again, right? He was going to refuse me, but let me ask him again. So I I sent him a text message. Within a few seconds, he said, yes, I'm ready to come on. Now, unbeknown to me, Sami Hamdi was going through his period where he said, look, subhanAllah, I was putting things on YouTube and 10 people were listening to it. And I got to a point where I said, that's it. No one's listening to me. No one cares about political analysis. Like, how am I fooling myself? So he got so every time he was refusing me was because he's, no one's going to listen to me anymore. Why should? And when I text him, it was the point where he was sitting with his father, and his father was telling him off. You never respond to people. You've got so much talent. Why don't you give this talent? So his father was telling him, why are you, not, you've got so much to give this ummah. So Sami, then the text comes, and the father says, who's this? Who's texting you? So this guy, Muhammad Jalal, he wants me to come on his podcast. Only 2 people will listen to it. So who cares, And the father said, no, you have to, told him you have to go on. Yeah, he's given you an opportunity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has opened you a door, and you're refusing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy and his bounty. And so Sami said, okay, yes, you're right. Sorry. So he came on the show, and subhanAllah, that show became viral and it went everywhere. And, people are still, you still have comments on that show today that come up. So, subhanAllah, even someone like Sami, who we know as the courageous, this is insan. We know this even from the story of the Sahaba, right? These are live human beings, and they have ups and downs in their lives. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He sometimes gives us people at the right time. And I believe, that someone like Sami and what he brought to the table after October the 7th has really transformed the way we view Gaza and the way we view, these situations of our ummah. Before, Sami was speaking, and of course it's not just one person, but before he was speaking, I remember we were all in doom and gloom, and, we felt this was a horrific. And Sami turned that around and made us active. So I can't stress how, I think you have a great opportunity here, because you've got young minds And we don't just want those young minds to go into corporates and to die and ossify for the next 20, 30, 40 years. We want those young minds to find solutions for our Muslim ummah. And I wish and pray that, in 10 years' time, you get dozens of students who contact you who said, I created this tech solution, or I'm part of this project for Gaza, or to rebuild Gaza, or I'm part of this initiative. That's really what is a marker of success, at least in sort of our sense, right? Of people who aren't just, using this education for their own selves, but actually using this education for our ummah. And that's what I wish and pray we, through the podcast, through all of our means, schooling or whatever, we inspire a new generation to be better than us, inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah, Muhammad, our time has elapsed, but we've got a little mystery book here that passes hands between successive guests, and each guest is tasked towards the end of the interview just to pen in a question, a mystery question that the next guest ought to answer. Yes. So it's over to you to obviously read out this question and perhaps provide us a response on this one.
Subhanallah. So the question is, so we're reading this question here. Which one of Allah's favors do you hold closest to your heart? Subhanallah. That's from Yvonne Ridley. Is that from Yvonne Ridley? Yes, it says Yvonne Ridley's name. Subhanallah. That's a great question from our sister. Subhanallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me an opportunity to serve this ummah, at least as I see it, right? To serve this ummah in a way in which I could never have imagined. If you had asked me 10 years ago as an educator that I would be running a podcast, and this will be, alhamdulillah, this podcast will be able to inspire, the guests of the podcast will be able to inspire people around the world, I would have said, come on, how would I be able to get to that place? And then if you ask me how I got there, I can only say it's through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ni'mah. There's actually no planning. There was no planning involved at all. I once met one of my guests. I spoke to him off camera, Dr. Azam Tamimi, Palestinian, who comes to South Africa a lot. And I asked him this question. I said, did your life pan out as you wished it to pan out? And he said, no, nothing. Nothing in my life was meant to be. He said, when I came to England, I was only meant to be here for a few weeks. And then I end up staying here. And then everything in life, regardless of how much you plan and meticulously, and we have to plan, but I think the most profound things in life come not out of planning, but come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and him subhanahu wa ta'ala placing you in a position, or at least giving you an option. Sometimes you refuse that option and you deny, the mercy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has offered you. So I always marvel at just how our Creator opens doors for you, even if you can never. I'm not a media guy. If you ask me, I didn't even know what a microphone quality was when I started this. But it just all fell into place. And the people who I came across to help me, you'd be amazed. I would go to an Islamic event, and then I would meet someone. And that same person would help me to do my set design. I never thought I would meet a person like that at this particular iftar or whatever it may be. So, I think in answer to our sister's question, I think it's the favor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He opens doors for you. And it's still your duty, your responsibility to accept that ni'mah that Allah gives you. That opportunity that Allah gives you. And sometimes we don't accept it, and we don't accept the sign, or we don't read the sign properly. But often I'm now concluded that when a door opens, you run towards that door, even if you don't know what's behind it really. So I don't really believe that if you ask me in 5 years' time, are you going to be a podcaster? I've now concluded, I don't know actually. I don't really know whether this was just a gateway to something else. And maybe it was, the opportunity was to open the doors to other individuals, to Dr. Sohail Hanif, or to Sami Hamdi, or to others who are going to do better than I. And my podcast fizzles into nothingness, and that's fine, because this is all part of Allah's plans.
Thank you so much. We've been speaking over the past few minutes to Muhammad Jalal. He's a political scientist, educator, and host of the Thinking Muslim podcast. I thank you so much for the thoughtful responses. There's probably so much more I'd like to expand on, some more reflections on South Africa, the reflections on Muslim media, specific discussions that you had over the years, untold stories. There's much more that we can speak about, but hopefully everything that we've spoken about, there's benefit and khair for us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for this initiative, your entire team, and allow it to continue to open minds and drive thoughtful Muslim discourse across the world. Jazakallah khairan, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much.